My research question is, why do virtual reality games induce motion sickness, and how do the different methods of locomotion help reduce this sickness? Let's break this down. According to Webster's dictionary, virtual reality is an artificial environment which is experienced through sensory stimuli such as sights and sounds provided by a computer. Like any other technology, it has many applications from medical to entertainment. While this technology has been around for many years, in the last 2 years, there has been a massive push in the video game industry. Why? Because the technologies in consumer devices is capable of handling the computing power needed to create the virtual worlds. As part of this push, Steven Spielberg released the movie Ready Player One. When this movie was released, I was not excited to see it. I thought it would be another movie with heavy CGI effects and no real story, but decided to give it a shot. I was truly surprised, and this has become one of my favorite movies. It reawakened the young kid in me that could play video games for 8 hours. As I got older, my passion for video games gradually faded. Having a full-time job and raising kids changed my priorities. But now, I felt like that young kid and wanted to get back into it. I started doing research on virtual reality systems to see what was available and how far the technology had progressed in recent years. The top 3 video game VR systems available to consumers are the HTC Vive, Facebook's Oculus Rift, and Sony's PlayStation VR. While each system has its strengths and weaknesses, I decided on the Oculus Rift. Luckily, my 40th birthday was around the corner and I was able to persuade my wife to purchase the Oculus Rift. This brings me to the first part of my research question. After purchasing a virtual reality unit, I noticed that I could play some games for a long time. I also made this first-time VR mistake described by Simon Revley, a VR roller coaster engineer.
A lot of people, the first thing they do when they get a VR headset is they'll download a virtual roller coaster, and it's the worst thing you can do, really. Just because of something called the locomotion problem, which in VR means that if your body isn't doing what your brain tells you it's doing, i.e. the disconnect between what you see and what you feel, then that can make you feel really ill.
Like Revley stated, roller coaster and other VR games would make me sick, and I had to take a break. This was also true for friends and family that would try the Oculus Rift. I thought this was motion sickness, but doing my research I noticed discrepancies. Nagasaki and Wendell referred to it as VR sickness, or cyber sickness in their article, Virtual Reality Environment Design of Managing Both Presence and Virtual Reality Sickness, while others referred to it simply as motion sickness. In traditional motion sickness, the person is in some sort of motion, such as a boat or car. This lack of motion is why I think the term VR sickness is more appropriate. However, looking at the symptoms of motion sickness, you can see the symptoms are about the same. Symptoms of VR sickness include headache, vertigo, and nausea, among others. While the exact cause of motion sickness is not known, one theory is that your brain thinks you're being poisoned, which would explain the nausea and vomiting. VR sickness is triggered by at least 2 things. The first thing is the quality of the display being used. While devices like the Oculus Rift have come a long way, there's still room for improvement. Researchers from Stanford University are working on alternative solutions. Let's check out what they're working on.
The new device better imitates how your eyes see.
What it actually allows you to do is to focus anywhere in the scene like you do in the real world.
Current virtual reality headsets can cause some people to get headaches or nausea.
It's very similar to motion sickness.
The next generation of virtual reality headsets, developed at Stanford University, may eliminate motion sickness for some users.
The second reason for VR sickness is a direct result of movement in a game. These are a few volunteers trying the game called Dead and Buried, in which the player is in one position, and the racing game Dirt Rally, where the player is inside a car. These are the responses after playing both games.
My head and my stomach hurts. My head more. I'm sweating. My fingers are sweating. Why are video games harder to drive than real life? Look at all these people I'm about to kill.
But not like super sick.
Does your tummy upset or not?
Yes.
Your tummy is upset?
My tummy's a little upset.
Let's finish playing the driving game.
Yeah.
What is it doing?
My head hurt.
How about the cowboy one?
Yeah.
Did you feel sick?
No, it didn't make me feel sick.
And the driving one?
No.
Not at all. As I expected, the sudden movement and sensation of being in a moving car was more likely to induce VR sickness, and the symptoms described match. I personally can only race around for a few minutes before getting nauseous. Why are these players like myself getting sick? According to Nobuhisa Tanaka and Hideyuki Tagaki, it is widely considered that the primary factor causing VR sickness is a physical law inconsistency between the visual, vestibular, and peculiar information provided by the VR environment to imply movement. In other words, the information the brain receives from the eyes and from the inner ear does not match. In the racing car game, the player's eyes are telling them you are moving at more than 50 miles an hour, but the inner ear is telling them you're just sitting in a chair. Now, the second part of my question: how do the methods of locomotion help reduce this sickness? Locomotion can be referred to as travel, which is defined as the control of the user's viewpoint motion in a three-dimensional environment, according to Rasmus Carlson and Avril Savine's article on VR locomotion. In most modern video games, the most common method of locomotion is called artificial locomotion, similar to this. See, the player moves around as you would in the real world. A very small sample of players get sick from this type of locomotion. However, virtual reality games that use this kind of motion are very likely to make a player sick. As a result, video game designers have come up with new methods of locomotion. The main ones are teleportation and physical movement. For this project, I'm going to focus on these methods of locomotion. The simplest and most obvious solution for VR sickness is to keep the player in one position. Physical movement locomotion. What the user sees in the virtual reality environment is exactly the same information the player's body is reporting to the brain, reducing player sickness. As a result, a large number of virtual reality games are based on this type of locomotion. These games keep the player in an area of about 6 by 6 feet where the player can interact with the virtual world without getting sick. Teleportation locomotion is the second most popular method of movement in VR games. This method has been modified and is still in constant change. There's instant teleportation, fast teleportation, blink teleportation, and many other small variations. Game developers keep trying to find the holy grail of locomotion for obvious reasons. More players equal larger profits. Rasmus Carlson and Avril Savine did a study of the various methods of locomotion and how the players were affected. The research included Arizona Sunshine, raw data, sports bar VR, and budget cuts. They had their participants play each game and then fill out a survey. They concluded that physical movement locomotion was the least likely to induce VR sickness, followed by teleportation, and lastly, artificial locomotion. While this was true for the most part, they broke down VR sickness into all the different symptoms in their survey, and surprisingly, physical locomotion was responsible for the most participants complaining of sweating. They also concluded that game's level of immersion and pleasure affected the participants' level of sickness. Virtual reality has been around for many years, and while there have been able to recreate amazing VR worlds using current consumer hardware, the VR sickness problem is still a hurdle that needs to be solved for VR to become mainstream, like in Spielberg's Player One Ready.